Michael asked me if I'd do him the honour of introducing him, which of course may seem amusing to some, and especially given that he's already been managing everything out there and doing a fine job. But for those who don't know much about Michael, he's our minister here at Blackwood Uniting, has been for the last 2.5 years. He's had an interesting path, to say the least, in coming to us, given that we were his first pastoral appointment. But it probably informs the subject matter of tonight's talk on science and wonder. It initially involved chemistry, completing an undergraduate and an honours degree at the Uni of Adelaide back in 1980. He worked for 5 years as an analytical chemist and an industrial chemist, and then entered the field of scientific instrumentation sales, service and technical support. I know just a smidgen about that sort of work because my brother also did that. I could never work out the fact that you needed a science degree to be a salesman, but eventually I did work it out. And I'm not really sure that you're employed as a salesman specifically, but he was, right. He certainly got the gift of the gab, so it would work well, I think. He did that for over 20 years, representing a number of international firms, including Hewlett-Packard, which I'll have a chat to him about afterwards. In 2007, this God thing snuck up on him. They are Michael's words, leading Michael to study for the ordained ministry and subsequently becoming a chaplain in aged care work for 6 years, as well as caring for his chronically ill wife, Joy, until her death. Since then, Michael's life has changed significantly. Not only has he become our minister here at Blackwood, but he's remarried to his beloved Karen, and Michael describes himself as the luckiest of men. Throughout this varied career, Michael's maintained a fascination with science, and we know a lot about that here because we hear a lot on Sundays, and it's fantastic. Especially the biological sciences, and I suspect we may get a sense of that fascination tonight. I present to you Michael Dowling.
I love this quote up on the screen, Albert Einstein. It's about questioning and curiosity and the importance of curiosity. One cannot help but be in awe when one contemplates the mystery of eternity, of life, of the marvellous structure of reality. It's enough if one tries to comprehend only a little bit of this mystery every day. I love this quote, and it's a very helpful entry to an upfront disclaimer on my part. And that is, when it comes to understanding the natural world and understanding how science has revealed some of the workings of the natural world, I am a child. To a first approximation, I know nothing. And yet, I think this is okay, according to Albert Einstein, just learning a little bit every day, just learning something that I didn't know yesterday, adding to that tiny bit of knowledge I've got about the wonders of the world. And I think that's kind of how I'd like to really have tonight go, that in the session before, in what we'll share now, in maybe a little group discussion later, the discussion at the end, we can share together our own awe and wonder in this universe. And I think it's okay, that thing about learning just a little bit every day. I have been interested in the how and why questions as long as I can remember. And I personally blame my parents because they bought me these things. The how and why wonder books. Every week there was a new title. The How and Why Wonder Book of Dinosaurs, the How and Why Wonder Book of Rockets and Missiles, of Magnetism and Electricity. I can't really remember distinguishing at the time between the how and the why questions. I was more caught up in the wonder of it all. But it is easy to get confused between the how and the why questions. as a little story will illustrate. Consider a story of a man who's walking down the road and he crosses the street, gets hit by a car, seriously injured, taken to hospital. He's going to survive, he's going to make a full recovery, but he's been seriously injured. There are a number of broken bones. He recovers from consciousness the following day. His wife visits him, and as he realises the scope of his injuries and how much rehab that's going to be required, he starts bewailing his fate to his wife. "Why has this happened to me?" And his wife, seeking to be really helpful, says to him, "Well, darling, I interviewed one of the witnesses and I think the causative factors are fairly clear. Apparently, just before you walked in front of the oncoming vehicle, you had your head down and you were texting on your phone. So I'd suspect the causative factors were distraction and inattention." He goes, No, I don't want to know how it happened. I want to know why it happened. What purpose does it serve? We can get confused about the how and the why question. So maybe we need a little bit of help from an ancient genius from antiquity. Aristotle lived at the time of the great philosophers, at a time before the sciences had spun off. Chemistry, physics, biology, everything was part of philosophy, philosophia, the love of wisdom. Everything was brought to bear on a problem. And Aristotle had a particular way of trying to understand those how and why questions, how to explain something. For example, how to explain that. Aristotle had what is referred to as fourfold causality, fourfold causation. Now that might puzzle us because, hang on, just, that causes that. What's this fourfold thing? So look at it, if you will, as a fourfold explanatory framework. And the first part is, well, trying to explain it, what stuff is it made of? What Aristotle called the material cause. Now, geologists will give you one answer, a chemist a different answer. But this isn't just a lump of marble, it's got a particular shape, it's got a form, what Aristotle called the formal cause. But these statues don't just magically pop up out of the ground like carrots. They're shaped by the hand of a master craftsperson, what Aristotle called the efficient cause. And the final cause is, what is its purpose? Now, without getting into the mind of Michelangelo when he sculpted the statue of David, perhaps we could surmise that he wanted to inspire the viewer with the beauty of the male form. Now, science, in its understanding of the natural world, is focused very much on the material cause, what stuff is made of, the form, how it's shaped and how its function is accorded, and also the efficient cause, what actually brings it about. Science has focused less on the final cause, what is its purpose, and certainly focused a lot less on the big final cause questions. What is the purpose of existence? What is the purpose of my life? One wag once said that science is the art of replacing important questions that can't be answered with unimportant ones that can be. But I actually prefer the line from former Chief Rabbi of the Commonwealth, Lord Dr. Jonathan Sacks, when he once said in an interview on Big Ideas with Norman Swan, "Science pulls things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean." In fact, the word religion comes from the Latin religio, to re-ligament, to reconnect. And I think at its best, religion can form this integrative function where everything is brought to our disposal. Yes, theology, yes, faith, but also the understandings of science, the understandings of philosophy and psychology. I think religion can form that integrative function. But all too often, religion has been a source not of integration but of division, of claiming ultimate authority in itself. But I'm not here to critique religion rather than to talk about the wonders as revealed by science. And the wonder of science has largely been through the power of something called reductionism. And here I'm using the term in terms of reductionism as a scientific technique. Because if we look at the world, today we've heard all sorts of things from our three wonder speakers about the wonders in the heavens, the wonders in the microscopic realm, the wonders of trees. There are wonders everywhere, but you can't look at the entire world at once. It's too complicated. So scientists will look at a little piece of the world, and an even smaller piece, and an even smaller piece. And all those little pieces add up together. They'll reduce it down to a small thing and build it back up again. It's been extremely successful in developing scientific theories of the world. But here we need to understand what is meant by theory and fact. You may have heard these phrases, for example. You may have heard perhaps people of a more fundamentalist religious persuasion say, oh, evolution, it's just a theory. And occasionally you'll hear a shrill voice from the other side saying, evolution's not a theory, it's a fact. Both comments, I believe, are misguided, for they fail to appreciate deeply what theory means in a scientific term. Let's distinguish, for example, in the topic of gravity, between the fact of gravity and the theory of gravity. Isaac Newton in the 17th century, the famous story about an apple falling on his head. When you have something, it drops. A fact of gravity. Now that apple falling on his head didn't solve the problem for him. Apples had fallen on all sorts of people's heads, apocryphal story though it is. But what happened from there was that Isaac Newton took what had previously been regarded as two entirely different things and unified them. Previously, when people looked at the object of projectiles on the Earth's surface, they thought that those objects went down to Earth because it was a property of the substance itself. This thing here had pondus in the Greek, or gravitas in the Latin. It was heavy, it had natural weight and gravitas, that's why it went to Earth. The movement of the stars and the planets, well, that was in the realm of the gods. And yet Newton, in his genius, actually unified these two fields with his universal law or universal theory of gravitation. And this was so spectacularly successful in explaining the movement of projectiles and the movement of the stars and the planets, that one could be forgiven for saying that that theory of Newton had progressed, it had been elevated from mere theory now to fact. So they would have been surprised when, about 250 years later, another genius, Albert Einstein, comes along and shows that Newton's theory is but a limiting case to describe gravity. When gravity is extremely strong or the object is travelling near the speed of light, all bets are off. Newton's law or theory or law or fact is not a fact. Likewise, Albert Einstein himself, genius that he was, is almost certain not to have the last word on gravity as well, because his general theory of relativity does not handle the realm of the very small, the quantum realm. There is no quantum theory of gravity. So once again, it is not a fact. Scientific theories are not facts. Well-established scientific theories are much, much more than mere facts. Well-established, verified, tested scientific theories provide an explanatory framework to explain the observation of many facts, a predictive framework to predict facts that have not yet been observed. And scientific theories provide the theoretical underpinning for all the wonderful technologies we have in our world. To give but a single example, the GPS systems that we have in our mobile phones that allow us to navigate are reliant on a network of 31 medium orbit satellites 20,000 kilometres above the surface of the Earth and relaying signals between the clocks on board and the clocks down low and actually measuring the time signals. And they are utterly reliant on Einstein's special and general theories of relativity that have this utterly counterintuitive reality that the clocks on board the satellite and the clocks at Earth do not tick at the same rate. And without that minor adjustment, 38 microseconds a day, your GPS would be hopelessly inaccurate within minutes. So, scientific theories are not facts. They are much, much more than mere facts. So we've heard about the power of reductionism in science in developing these theories as technique. But now, if we move to reductionism instead as philosophy. And we know that we've moved to reductionism as philosophy when we hear the term nothing but. One of the famous nothing but proponents was Francis Crick, who won a Nobel Prize for his co-discovery of the structure of DNA, and later he moved into the field of consciousness research. And he is famously quoted for saying that we human beings, we're nothing but a pack of neurons. C.S. Lewis had a term for this reductionism as philosophy. He called it the nothing buttery approach. I actually blame Margaret Thatcher, frankly, for starting this whole sordid reductionism as philosophy thing. Years ago, she once famously said, in her very natural, unaffected voice, "There is no such thing as society. There are only individuals." So, sociology is nothing but individual psychology, which is nothing but the underlying biology, which is nothing but the underlying chemistry, which is nothing but the underlying physics, which is nothing but quarks and electrons, ultimately. Now, I've gone through my own reductionistic phase and spent a little bit of time with quarks and electrons, but a lot more time with neurons, the pack of neurons that Francis Crick alludes to. I've spent a lot of time seeking awe by trying to understand as much about the brain as I can, excitatory postsynaptic potentials, metabotropic receptors. If only I could learn enough about neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, then maybe I'd understand what it was to be human. But I found as I investigated it that my awe turned to ashes. And a recovery from that ash-filled phase was helped by two things. One, a poem that I'll share a bit later. But secondly, a way of looking at the world that moves beyond mere reductionism to something deeper, but which in no way sacrifices critical thinking. I'll share that with you in a moment. But first, I want to share with you, as we shared three little pieces of wonder out there, I want to share three little pieces of wonder here. They're three very brief video clips. The first is something to do with the immune system. Now, the immune system's quite popular at the moment. I don't know if you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Very important. And there are two parts of the immune system. This is going to be talking about the really simple part, the innate immune system. We've got a part that's much more complicated, much smarter than this. This is the dumb bit, okay? We have a few little heroes in this. This is an actual video from many years ago of a microscope slide. It has a bacterium. It has something called a neutrophil, which is one of the cells of the innate immune system. It's a first responder. If you get cut or an infection, neutrophils will flock to that area. And we see also red blood cells. Watch the video. Scientists can explain that the bacterial cell releases something called a chemoattractant chemical, which binds to a receptor on the surface of the neutrophil, which causes this intracellular signal transduction cascade, a whole series of reactions inside it that results in amoeboid motion of the neutrophil in the direction of increasing concentration of that chemoattractant. Eventually it engulfs it in a process called phagocytosis, cell eating, where it chews it up. Now, that understanding of science, to me, does absolutely nothing to dispel the wonder that this thing without a brain, this neutrophil, can smell an invading bacterial cell, chase it and eat it. The utter wonder of it all. Wonder number 2, the kinesin motor protein. You may have heard of the genes in our body, the genes in our DNA, which Francis Crick is very famous for. Genes encode proteins. Proteins are the workhorses of the cell. Some are structural proteins, others form enzymes. Their very detailed structure allows them to catalyse reactions. Some are motor proteins. Here, the co-discoverer of the kinesin motor protein is going to tell us a little bit about it.
Just like a busy city, there's constant motion inside of your cells. There's new construction, demolition, and most importantly, transporting goods from one place in the cell to another. Cells transport goods along cellular roadways. To transport cargo along these roads, the cells use motor proteins. Kinesin is one of these motor proteins. If you didn't have kinesin and other motor proteins, you simply wouldn't be alive. What we know now is that kinesin effectively has 2 legs, and these legs are able to coordinate a walking motion along a track. That track is called a microtubule, and the kinesin undergoes this beautiful choreographed walking action. While the kinesin is walking along this track, at the other end of the kinesin, it gets hooked up to a cargo. These motor proteins move quickly and efficiently. Relative to their size, they move as fast as a car on a freeway, but they're 4 times more efficient than your car in converting chemical energy into motion. We discovered kinesin in 1984. I was 25 years old at the time and a graduate student. I was interested in the transportation system inside of nerve cells. What makes nerve cells so interesting is that they're extraordinarily long cells. For example, the part of your nerve cell that has the nucleus, where the DNA is located in your spinal cord. But it can extend a very long tube all the way, for example, to your foot. All of the building blocks for that nerve cell are made in your spinal cord, and all those building blocks have to be shipped to the very end of that nerve cell a meter away. There had to be some kind of transport system that was moving these building blocks inside the nerve cell, and I wanted to know how that transportation system worked.
Once again, scientists like Ron Bale have been able to describe how that walking process works, that the motor protein kinesin binds this energy molecule, ATP, and through binding it produces a structural change in the protein that throws one of the legs forward. Then it releases it, throwing the other leg forward. You can explain that in scientific terms through these brilliant scientists. But again, it takes away in no shade at all the utter wonder that inside the cells in our body, transporting nutrients and other components from one end of the cell to another, is something that looks like it came out of a science fiction movie, carrying a giant Santa sack of goodies. The utter wonder of it. the third and final brief video. This is about the cuttlefish.
The cuttlefish has taken camouflage to the next level. They can change their colour, shape and texture to blend in with the background. It's hard to believe it looking at these pictures, but all these cuttlefish are exactly the same species. They're simply changing their appearance depending on what's around them. It's called adaptive camouflage, and it's perfect for hiding from both predators and prey.
Given how unbelievable the biological world is, I have to say that I stunned myself at how reluctant I was to ever inquire into it. Back when I was in high school, no interest at all in the science of biology. Chemistry was the only science I was interested in. Same at university. No interest in the science of biology at all. I resisted all efforts to do a unit in it, and I successfully avoided it for years until many years later, due to a work requirement, I really needed to learn something about biology. So I started to look at these squishy things that were living and try and work out what they were. And I'd look at things like cells and I'd say, okay, what's it made of? A plasma membrane. Well, that's just made of lipid, fat molecules. They're just molecules, just chemicals. What about the nucleus? Oh, it's got DNA. Interesting helical structure, but just a molecule. Proteins, again, interesting structure, but just molecules. Where's this life thing? And then it's slowly dawning on me. Every living cell, every living thing, consisting only of non-living molecules. And eventually the penny dropped. It was like being shot through the forehead with a diamond bullet. Are you seriously telling me that if I combine these non-living molecules in a sufficiently interesting way that the end result will be living? That's exactly what I'm saying. One of the founders of quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr, is quoted as saying, "If quantum mechanics doesn't profoundly astound us, then we have not understood it." If we are not profoundly astounded by the fact that we can combine non-living molecules and the end result will be living, then we have not understood it. To underline this point a little more dramatically, a thought experiment. Consider yourself transported 1,000 years into the future, and you go in this future time to a medical clinic where you are going to participate in a clinical trial of sorts. It will involve you having a body scan, but not an MRI or a CT scan. This is a three-dimensional atomic level photocopy where every atom in your body has its spatial location identified in the context of the molecule in which it's present, the molecules in the context of the cells they're present in, the cells in the context of the tissues and organs. An exact atomic spatial location of everything in you. And then the technician, having scanned you, sends the output to a 3D printer. Now, one of our wonderful volunteers in the bike shed, Robin, makes these fantastic little nose clips for your mask on his 3D printer. Fantastic. Robin, until I got one of these, my mask kept fogging up, my glasses kept fogging up. Now it's solved. 20 cents from a 3D printer. Brilliant. But that's not the sort of 3D printer that the technician is sending your atomic photocopy to. He is sending it to a 3D printer, not with plastic as its feedstock, but with atoms, carbon atoms, nitrogen, oxygen, and an exact copy of you is printed, atom by non-living atom. And when that copy is made, when your copy is printed, atom by non-living atom, the end result will be the living you with your thoughts and your feelings and your memories. Sit with that thought for a moment and ask if it is any wonder that over the millennia we have posited the need for a soul to animate non-living tissue. We need some animating force. And yet, the wonder may be even more wonderful still. Rather than a soul being something that's put into inanimate matter to give it life, a soul, and I use the word here in inverted commas, a soul is something that emerges out of inanimate matter and gives it life. More about this soul in inverted commas in a moment, but first that word emergence that I've used very deliberately. Emergence is observed right through the natural world by scientists. One definition from Harold Morowitz, the emergence of everything. Emergence occurs only when the activities of the parts do not simply seem to give the activity of the whole. For emergence, the whole is indeed more than the sum of the parts. In this book, Harold Morowitz identifies 28 different levels of emergence. I'm just going to look at a few of them. Each of these levels of emergence has something in common. Each level of emergence exhibits a capacity not seen at previous levels. We have that first emergence, 13.7 billion years ago, the primordial universe from what? Who knows what? A new capacity has emerged. The emergence in the early universe of the first elements, hydrogen and helium, with properties entirely unlike the quarks and electrons that made them up. The first stars formed by gravitational clumping of hydrogen and helium, producing stellar factories, as David shared with us earlier, for the synthesis of the higher elements, flung into space in giant supernovae explosions, incorporated in later generations of stars like our own, around which orbit rocky planets like our Earth. But the two most staggering levels of emergence, which I want to focus on, are the emergence of life and consciousness. Life, the emergence of life, abiogenesis. Now, to be very clear here, I am not talking about evolution. Evolution requires life on which to work. This precedes evolution. And in fact, the study of the origins of life, the origin of life from non-life, is a very active field of scientific research as people try to understand the chemical and physical mechanisms of life having emerged out of non-life. There is still debate about the likelihood of this having occurred, given the staggering complexity of the simplest cell in comparison to mere molecules. One possibility has it that the formation of life, that abiogenesis event, is a little bit like a tornado ripping through a junkyard and by chance forming a fully functional Boeing 747. The likelihood is such that it makes the number of inhabitable worlds in our universe pale into insignificance as a small number. It is very possible, if it is that unlikely, that we are the only inhabited planet in the universe. Or it could be that there are as yet ununderstood principles and processes that lead to the likelihood of life forming. The second part, the emergence of consciousness. I want to focus on these two, the emergence of life and consciousness, because it ties in to that soul in inverted commas. Back to our mate Aristotle. Aristotle had a very weird idea about soul. He actually described different levels of soul Plants had vegetative souls, animals, animal souls. Humans uniquely had a rational soul. Now, we might be tempted to describe this as pagan gibberish until we understand where he was coming from. Where he was coming from was conceiving of soul as a higher level of emergent capacity. If we look at that first level, that life as a new level of emergent capacity, we could say, well, it's just chemicals. My cells, they've just got chemicals. But it is like chemistry that is seen nowhere outside the living sphere. Chemistry that is staggering in its complexity. Cycles upon cycles, networks of chemical reactions, staggering. You simply do not see it outside of life. And in fact, one could say that life does not contradict the laws of chemistry at all, but it unleashes the potential that was only potential before and is actualized in living things. Consciousness, too, has something staggering in terms of an emergent capacity. We're familiar now with this reductionist philosophy of quarks building up things, physics building up chemistry, building up biology, what could be called bottom-up causation. But consciousness has the capacity for top-down causation as a new level of emergent capacity that operates in the opposite direction to reductionism. Now, to make this clear, a simple illustration will make it very clear. Consider the phenomenon of depression. If we are depressed, we can deal with that in either a bottom-up fashion or a top-down fashion. If we wish to go for a bottom-up fashion, you might visit your doctor, and on consulting with you, your doctor might write you a script for an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Now, this thing apparently inhibits the reuptake of serotonin. There are circuits in your brain where the active neurotransmitter is serotonin. They're called serotonergic circuits. And in that circuit, serotonin is released from the first neuron, and it finds its way across this tiny gap between the two neurons called the synapse. And there it binds to a receptor on the second neuron. And by binding on it, it opens an ion channel which slightly increases the likelihood of that second neuron firing. But the body doesn't like uncontrolled things with serotonin just floating around willy-nilly, so it has ways of mopping up the serotonin, at least two ways, one of which is to have these receptors on the previous neuron actually take up serotonin. They mop it back up. There's reuptake. An SSRI actually blocks those sites. It is a reuptake inhibitor. And so it means that serotonin just floats around, pings on the second neuron, ping, 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 increases the likelihood of firing, and that circuit becomes more active. Over a period of a few weeks, some people will experience a subjective lift in mood. What happens is a change of molecules produces a change in mind. Bottom-up causation. But we can also work the other way. I can, if I am depressed, through an act of will, drag myself out of my bed and go for a walk in the Sturt Gorge and follow the contents of my thoughts, look at them but not follow them where they go. I can walk through that beautiful nature and do it each day through an act of will. And through that process, activate chemical circuits in my brain that otherwise would not be activated. We have a change in mind through choice, producing a change in molecules. Top-down causation. If you want to see some of the most amazing capacities of the human being for top-down causation, you should read some of the work that Matthew Ricard has done with neuroscientists. Matthew Ricard, PhD scientist and now a Buddhist monk of 50 years standing, the Dalai Lama's French translator, someone who has created NGOs around the Indian subcontinent, a tremendous compassionate worker, but he's worked for 20 years with neuroscientists and psychologists to map the human brain in different contemplative states, and has shown uncategorically that a change in mind, the ability to meditate, to use mindfulness practice, the ability to do things like cognitive behavioural therapy, going out in nature, can actually produce a change in our neurochemistry. It is not just molecules changing mind in a reductionistic fashion. It is both ways, mind changing molecules. But as much as this amazes me, some of the findings from Matthew Ricard and Daniel Goldman and Tanya Singer's work, what moves me the most is the capacity of the human conscious mind in extreme circumstances. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist, was imprisoned by the Nazis at Auschwitz. And in that hell on earth, you would think he would be the utter victim of reductionistic tendencies, treated as subhuman vermin by his captors. You're hated by your captors. Hate them back. You're starving, every man for himself. And there was some of that, Frankl said. But there were other things where he observed people who were hated by their captors but chose, through a conscious act of will, not to hate. Starving men who gave away their last piece of bread to a stranger in greater need. The extraordinary capacity. In that hell on earth, he found what he described as the last of the human freedoms. Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, the capacity to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Our ability to choose. I wonder, as extraordinary as this is, are we humans the pinnacle of emergent evolution? This 13.7 billion year emergent journey, the emergence of the primordial universe, the first elements, those stars that synthesize the elements of which we are made, rocky planets, the emergence of life, and this amazing consciousness, are we it? Are we the summit? If we look at this transition of these different emergent levels from matter, non-living matter, to life, to consciousness, what will be the next level of emergence? And to be clear, I am not talking here about a new species, what we might evolve into. That's kind of neither here nor there. I'm talking about something that is as different from us as life is from non-life and consciousness is from mere life. What that might be, I think, is beyond our capacity to understand. Robert Hazen, one of the great researchers in the area of origins of life research, had this to say: is human intelligence the highest possible emergent state? Or is it possible that there might be higher levels or orders of emergence? If so, then it's also possible that our individual brains can no more comprehend such a state than a single neuron can comprehend consciousness. Perhaps the universe holds levels of emergence beyond individual consciousness and even beyond the collective accomplishments of human societies. If that is true, then the story of life's origin and evolution is far from over. Perhaps the story has only begun. One final visit to Aristotle. Not explaining something like David, but explaining something difficult, like existence. Science has been wonderful at explaining the material side, the structure of the universe, the structure of atoms, the causal mechanisms, but not so good with that final cause. What is the purpose of existence? What is the purpose of my existence? Some people will say, there is no purpose to existence. It is utterly meaningless. You may have heard that from time to time, that there is no meaning to existence. Others will say, absolutely there is, but I wonder whether we have enough information yet, whether the real purpose of existence might actually be in the future on one of those emergent levels. I wonder. For myself, I love a particular word that's used, and it's a word by two people, a famous physicist and a famous Franciscan. John Archibald Wheeler, a very revolutionary physicist, said, "We are not only observers, we are participators. In some strange sense, this is a participatory universe." Now, he meant this not just in a general sense, but in a deep quantum mechanical sense that needn't concern us. The Franciscan, Richard Rohr, said, "Religion as participation is a rediscovery of the perennial tradition that so many saints and mystics have spoken of in their own ways. It constantly recognises that we are part of something more than we are observing something or believing in something." Imagine that, seeing religion as participation rather than something to bash someone else over the head with. What an invitation. If we are here, we amazing living conscious beings are here as a result of these successive emergence levels, from this primordial universe to the first elements, from quarks to who we are. That invitation, what an invitation it is. That every quark and every quasar, every molecule and every mountain, every bacterium and every being such as us that has acquired the capacity for conscious thought are invited to participate in the unfolding emergence of this cosmic wonder. I mentioned earlier that I was brought back from that ash-filled reductionistic phase with a poem. I share it with you now. Now, there are some of you for whom the God concept is, in the words of Pierre-Simon Laplace, an unnecessary hypothesis. If that is the case for you, then with this poem, feel free to lose the last verse, but retain the wonder. It is a poem called Primary Wonder by Denise Levertov. Days pass when I forget the mystery. Problems insoluble and problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention. They crowd its antechamber along with a host of diversions. My courtiers wearing their coloured clothes, caps and bells. Then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. The throng's clamour recedes. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. However you are sustained, as you participate and engage with this existence, I would encourage you to seek and embrace the wonder in this wonderful life.